Hello, and welcome to the sixth of our series on the I am sayings of Jesus. Today we're going to look at when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I remember many years ago, writing this verse out in my best calligraphy writing and selling it on card to the guides to raise money for something or other. So this verse obviously meant quite a lot to me for many years. When somebody says, I am, you take note of what they're saying. They tell you something about themselves, like, I am a teacher, I am a student, I am a civil servant, or even, I am a Christian. 4 years ago, I went to Ghana, and a friend of mine was going to speak at a local church, and the lady who was going to introduce her asked her name, and my friend said, I'm Paula. So the lady stood up and she said she'd like to introduce, I am Paula. So way back at the beginning of the Bible, in Exodus, Moses meets God at the burning bush. He asks him for a name, and God says, I am who I am. This is a pivotal point in history when God reveals himself. And earlier on in John's Gospel in chapter 8, Jesus is confronted by people and they ask him, who are you? And he says, I am. At this, they're incensed. They knew exactly what he meant. They picked up rocks to try and stone him. In the Greek, when you read I am, it's an intense way of talking about yourself. Really, it means I, myself, and only I. So when Jesus said he was the way, the truth, and the life from John 14:6, if we read it in this context, we see it's in the middle of the Last Supper. I'll just read a few verses from John 14. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. There is more than enough room in my Father's home. If it were not so, I would have told you that I am going to prepare a place for you. When everything is ready, I will come and get you, so you will always be with me where I am, and you know the way to where I am going. No, we don't know, Lord, Thomas said. We have no idea where you are going, so how can we know the way? Jesus told him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me. So this was the last evening Jesus would spend with his disciples. He'd be telling them the most important things, the things he didn't want them to forget. He'd just washed their feet. He'd said one of them would betray him, and he said that Peter would disown him. So you can imagine when he said this, what they would be thinking or what they would be saying. But where did he say he was going? When's he coming back? Is he taking us with him? And Jesus says, you already know the way to where I am going. And Thomas's question is a very good question. We don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? Within a few hours, Jesus would be taken away from them at his arrest. In 24 hours, he would be dead. Could they keep hold of this statement that he was going to come back until he returned in 3 days? In this verse that Jesus says about himself, he uses the definite article. He says, I am the way, the truth, the life. This means the specific one. He doesn't use the indefinite article, a way, a truth, a life. He's not a version of the way, a version of the truth, a version of the life, but the only way, the only truth, the only life. Now, several years ago, I was going down to Hertfordshire for a dance conference with a friend of mine from the dance fellowship. She didn't come to the fellowship then, but a few years later she would join us, and that is Emma Lee. And on the way down, we stopped for a coffee and caught up with David and Andy, who was travelling in the same direction as us, going to the conference, but in a different car. Emma was very excited and texted Anthony, her husband, to say, I'm having a coffee with the Andy Green. So he is the specific Andy Green, the one and only. So let's have a look at these three things separately. First of all, when Jesus said, I am the way. One of the earliest names Christians called themselves was the way. And that's a really good description. We are the ones who point to Jesus, who alone is the way. So immediately after Jesus said these words, he says, no one comes to the Father except through me. So his listeners knew the correct way to approach God, according to the Hebrew scriptures. They knew which sacrifices to present at the temple and when. They knew about the requirements of the law. But Jesus says from now on, none of those things are the way. None of those things are sufficient to get to God. And it was necessary for Jesus to pay that sacrifice for once and for all. Jesus says he's the way, the path, the road to reach God. None of our other efforts would be good enough. We can't earn our way. We can't purchase a ticket by being good or doing good things. And when Jesus called his disciples, he said, follow me. And that's all that's necessary. Jesus said, I am the truth. Jesus is not a version of a truth, but the truth, the personification of truth. John starts his gospel at the very beginning by saying, in the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He existed in the beginning with God. Jesus is the incarnate Word of God, which means he came in human form and nature. So if God is the source of all truth, then Jesus himself is the source of all truth. It's a bold statement to make. And if it wasn't made by Jesus, then it would be untrue. And it would be bordering on insanity. And finally, Jesus says he is the life. In that first chapter of John's Gospel, he says, the Word gave life to everything that was created. Jesus is life itself. He's the initiator and the source of life. Later on in John 14, Jesus says, since I live, you also will live. In a few hours, they would think that he was dead. But in reality, this was not the truth. He would rise again. And because he lives, we can live also. The Passion Translation of John chapter 10, verse 10 says, I have come to give you everything in abundance, more than you expect, life in its fullness until you overflow. Now that's the kind of life I want. Not mere existing, but life in abundance, so that I can't help but overflow. While I was researching this talk, I came across a very good quote. It says, Jesus is gloriously inclusive and wonderfully exclusive. He is gloriously inclusive. He welcomed everyone who came to him, regardless of age, sex, education, race. But he's wonderfully exclusive. We cannot have that abundant life unless we recognize that he alone is the truth and the only way in which we can receive it. So finally, to think about, why did Jesus say this? Of course, he said it to his disciples, but also he says it to us. They would carry on his message. They would face persecution and death. But once they grabbed hold of this and knew the source of their truth and life, they would change people and they changed the world. And once we grasp this too, we will be changed and our world will never be the same. Thank you very much.